This is the lecture for Tuesday after final exams for European history. Those of you at home will have links to the images and videos that we just saw here, having to do with Marxism and Marx and Engels and things like that. Last time, we talked about the nature of philosophy in the pre-industrial age and compared it to the industrial age's first great philosophy, which is utopianism and its subset socialism, and one of its many iterations, communism. We talked about the influence on this new way of thinking by Hegel, the German philosopher. One of Hegel's big assumptions is materialism, which means basically, if it ain't matter, it don't matter. The only reality that Hegel acknowledges is that which is tangible, measurable, quantifiable. If you can hear it, see it, taste it, touch it, or smell it, it's real, whether you like it or not. If, in fact, you can't, then it's illusory. And so modern industrial age philosophy turns traditional philosophy and religion on its head by saying that the reality is material, not spiritual. However, Hegel does not leave it there. Hegel talks about how progress happens. And that is through what he calls the dialectic. Dialectical materialism is an alternative way of describing Marxism, Leninism, or socialism, communism in general. So it is that important in that the dialectic, along with materialism, is like Christendom. You're talking about the importance of Christianity in medieval times. You're talking about the importance of the dialectic. So we should understand this process. In order for progress to happen, everything that exists that is going to progress must encounter something. Now let's assume that everything and everyone that exists is its own thesis. I am a thesis, you are a thesis, we are all theses, and we stand for ourselves. Our thesis changes over time as we gain experiences. By the way, please take off any overgarments that are non-uniform. Thank you. But at some point, and actually, in reality, at several points in your life, your thesis, is going to encounter your equal and opposite. A challenge that can stop you cold. An enemy that can overthrow you and defeat you. And that equal and opposite, in whatever significant way you want to measure, is your antithesis. Antithesis. Get it? This stuff is pretty straightforward. So, a thesis encounters its nemesis, its equal and opposite, its antithesis. Now, are they just going to get along? Are they going to live and let live? Are they going to agree to disagree? No. It's the equal and opposite. It's everything that you think is wrong. That's why it's your antithesis. It is equivalent to you. That's why it's well matched. In ritual magic, one of the ways that you can kill someone, this is legendary, obviously, because ritual magic is not taught in schools these days, probably for good reason. One of the things that you can do is create a clone. So you get a little bit of their blood or flesh or hair or whatever, depending upon what myth cycle you're talking about, what tradition you're talking about. And through eldritch wizardry, you grow a clone. Now, that clone looks like them, may have their memories, but there can be only one. The future is going to either contain you or your clone impersonating you. So what the clone has to do, the first thing the clone has to do, is find and confront its origin. Find and confront its template. Find and confront you. And then there is a death struggle. And in that death struggle, if the template, if the original person is not expecting a sudden death struggle to come in the form of their doppelganger, their equal and opposite, their mirror image, they're probably going to die. And the evil sorcerer will have won. Finding your equal and opposite isn't quite as literal as that often. Usually it's something that is equivalent in weight, in terms of the weight of your thoughts, equivalent in sophistication, equivalent in some kind of whatever power you or your idea has. Thesis encounters antithesis, and it is like matter encountering its equal and opposite particle of antimatter. And what quantum physics tells us, quantum mechanics, is if you play around with antimatter, first of all, which is very dangerous and very difficult, and yet it's being done in Lucerne at the Super Collider in Europe, which should have been built here, I suppose, but wasn't. Thank you, Bill Clinton. You don't want to accidentally get a hold of a particle or a wavicle of antimatter that corresponds with any of the matter nearby. Because, boom, there can be only one. Only one. And what will ensue is an explosion that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So, thesis versus antithesis encounter one another, and they struggle with one another. And one is annihilated, and the other survives. But, in order to survive, as the thesis and the antithesis struggle and grapple with one another, they become like one another. Each side learns from the other. The advantages that my antithesis has over me, if I survive long enough, I'm going to learn. And I'm going to learn to compensate for them. He, on the other hand, or she, depending upon what you think is equal or opposite in a given moment, is going to learn my advantages, my ways of getting to him, her, and they're going to compensate as well. With the result being that whoever survives is not going to be as they were before the struggle. Now, it just so happens, by random factor, that I'm talking to my ancient history students about the Punic Wars, which you'll remember were between Rome and Carthage. And they're analogous to modern history's World War I and World War II. These are definitive big struggles that are going to set the stage for who will dominate the future. Rome versus Carthage. Who will dominate the Western Med and then go on to face the Greek world? Could have been either of them. They both had strengths. Now, in the First Punic War, you have a great example of thesis versus antithesis. Let's imagine that Rome is the thesis, because we're descendants of Rome, not Carthage, culturally. Well, the First Punic War is a big, gut-busting navy war. It's over the possession of Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily. Sicily starts out a split between Carthage and Rome. Sardinia and Corsica are all in Carthaginian hands. Why? Because Carthage, being a descendant of Phoenicia, has the premier war fleet in the Western Med. Remember, the Phoenicians are the premier mariners of the ancient world. The Greeks may be better at naval warfare, but nobody is better at seafaring in ancient times than the Phoenicians. And the Carthaginians are a colony of the Phoenicians. So they are at home on the sea in a way the Romans never really will be. There's a small problem, though. The Romans don't have a single warship. Not one. In a navy war, there's a slight problem with not having warships. So, The Romans are going to have to improvise, adapt, overcome, which is a credo of the United States Marine Corps. Improvise. You encounter a problem. You don't go, oh, life's unfair, it stinks, so what was me? No, you don't whinge and complain and whine like a millennial snowflake. None of you are millennials, and God willing, none of you will be whinging snowflakes. Presumably, you will have the intestinal fortitude to go, oh, that's an obstacle. I've got to improvise my way over it, around it, or through it. I've got to figure out a way to deal with this. Once I figure out a way to deal with this obstacle, I've got to adapt. I've got to do that. I've got to go over it, around it, or through it. And then it's in my, I've overcome it. It's in my rearview mirror. I move on. The Romans are going to have to do that. Luckily for them, a storm washes an empty Carthaginian warship onto the beaches of western Italy. The Romans take it apart, copy it, and suddenly they make dozens of copies and then hundreds of copies. So they're improvising a solution by copying the most advanced warship the Carthaginians have, and now Rome has a battle fleet. But, of course, having warships is not the same thing as understanding how to use warships. And whenever the Romans try to fight the Carthaginians Carthaginian style, which is in battles of maneuver using catapults and ballistae and deck archers and occasional rams, the Romans get outmaneuvered because nobody is as good at sea in the Western Med as the Carthies. So, the Romans have to improvise their way around this problem, and they do so with the corvus, which you may remember from last year. The corvus is a big ramp that they have vertically near the bow of every Roman warship. Now, they put a big spike on the front of the ramp. And unlike the Carthaginians, who are fighting battles of maneuver, once the Romans have these corvi, they basically go straight at the Carthaginians, and when they're close enough, they swivel their corvus around and thwonk! The corvus goes into the deck of the Carthaginian warship. Now, that is going to hold the Carthaginian warship there. The Romans have their corvus well anchored on their side, and suddenly Roman legionaries cross the ramp, and the Carthies, who are expecting a long-distance naval engagement, suddenly have to fight with swords and shields, which they're not good at. So, Rome begins to win. They have improvised, they have adapted, they have overcome. And when Rome wins the First Punic War, they do so by becoming a synthesis of Rome prior to the war and Carthage prior to the war. They are Rome with all of its strength, and they have a war fleet that is based on Carthage's and Rome's approach to war. Now, oddly enough, the Second Punic War, which I'm going to talk to the ancient kids about today, also involves that, because the Carthaginians, who were weaker on land than the Romans, under Hamilcar Barca and his son Hannibal, developed land warfare techniques that are superior to the Romans. The Romans never expect the Carthaginians to become a challenge to them on land, but Hannibal kicks Roman butt for 14 years marching up and down Italy. When you are engaged in a death struggle with something that is equivalent to you, you have to improvise, adapt, and overcome, or you're going to die. That's just the way of it. In order to, the Darwinian way of saying this is adapt or perish. And you have to adapt if you want to survive, otherwise you will perish. So what comes out of the struggle, it honestly doesn't really matter whether the thesis or the antithesis wins, because what is going to survive is the synthesis of those two, the best qualities, presumably, of thesis and antithesis combined. That is how progress happens, according to Hegel. It is through conflict, and you accentuate the conflict, and you make the progress more efficient. Don't compromise. Have conflict, because conflict reveals the true face of things. When you're compromising, you can present a false front. You can deceive your opponent, and you can deceive yourself. The only real test of something is in battle, is in conflict. Another way of saying this is if you ever want to really know somebody, fight them. And then you'll see the real person. Now, this is one way to look at it. But there's another way. And that's a much more modern way. And it's a much less masculine way and a much more feminine way. I'm going to quote to you. Here we go. Sorry, now I've got to pull this up. Thanks. And I'm going to loom over you. If you don't like it, feel free to loom. Watchmen was a set of comics that became a graphic novel in the 1980s. It was made into a movie about 10, 12 years ago by Zack Snyder. And it's a story of what would superheroes be like in the actual world. But the only real superhero is a guy who goes through a physics experiment that causes him to become alive and aware at the molecular level. Sort of like a socialist society. He is driven away from the Earth, and he settles on Mars for a while. Being self-aware at the molecular level, he can adapt. But he has been human enough to have a girlfriend. The world is going to face nuclear annihilation unless he comes back and stops it, she believes. So she begs him to take her to Mars, and she then pleads with him for humanity. It's an interesting conversation. Try to imagine somebody pleading to a demigod about the worthiness of humanity to survive. At first, he's not buying it. Humanity is like a virus that the Earth contracted. Mars gets along just fine without people. Look at the beautiful scenery. Look at the Valles Marineris. Look at Mount Olympus Mons. But then something changes. He has an epiphany. And he says this, if I can read it without collapsing onto Lee. Thermodynamic miracles. Events with odds against so astronomical they're effectively impossible. Like oxygen spontaneously becoming gold. Multiply those odds, by countless generations against the odds of your ancestors being alive together, meeting, siring this precise son, that exact daughter. Of the 1,000 million children competing for existence, it was you, only you, that emerged. To distill so specific a form from that chaos of improbability, like turning air into gold, that is the crowning unlikelihood, the thermodynamic miracle. But the world is so full of people, so crowded with these miracles, they become commonplace and we forget. We gaze continually at the world and it grows dull in our perceptions, yet seen from afar, from another vantage point, as if new, it may still take the breath away. Consider the reality that every time a couple copulates, how many sperm are competing for how many eggs and how often does fertilization happen? In each copulation, there's a great unlikelihood that a specific sperm and a specific egg will fertilize and have a child. Multiply this by the number of times a married couple copulates and the fact that they don't have children each time that happens. Thank God. Take that then and go back a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, 5 generations. How unlikely is it that your great-grandparents would happen to meet, fall in love, and get married? How unlikely is it that they would even exist because your great-great-grandparents might have sired countless other children in their place? If you look at the odds, strictly on the level of that which is unlikely or rare is more valuable than that which is commonplace, Each human individual is, as religion tells us, of priceless value because we aren't likely. If you doubt this, and you have biological siblings, or if you know anyone who has biological siblings, you'll see the difference. The same parents produce very different people. But that's not all. My second girlfriend back in high school was an identical twin. She and her sister used to have fun by making believe they were one another, and unless you knew them well enough, they were good enough to pull it off sometimes. They had a wicked sense of humor. But being identical twins, they were very different from one another. They had to be. They chose to be because they didn't want to be seen as the same. Then there's the changeling legends. You have a parent that has two identical children, identical twins, but one of the twins is taken away, either adopted or stolen or whatever. So one of the twins grows up in a banker's family in Chicago, and the other one grows up in a family of farmers in Zimbabwe. By the time they're your age, they're going to be really different people. Genetically, they're almost identical. But experientially, very different. One might speak Mashona with English as a second language. The person in Chicago probably speaks English as their primary language, maybe Spanish as a second language. One grew up doing physical work in the sun. The other one grew up indoors mostly, going to school. One grew up in a failed state run by Marxists. Another grew up in up until now anyway, the most successful free market society and free society since Rome's Republic. Poor and wealthy, all of these differences because of life experience. So each of us is a vast unlikelihood, but arguably, each of us is a synthesis of mom and dad. Sexual reproduction exists in Earth biology for a reason. Because those creatures that reproduce asexually, like good old amoeba, basically are cloning themselves. There isn't much genetic drift between amoeba A, amoeba B, amoeba C, and amoeba D. A little joke there. Now, human beings, along with most complex creatures, reproduce sexually. And what that means is, unless you are the victim of incest or engaged in some weird form of royal incest or theocratic incest like the Egyptians did, you've got two very different bloodlines at work. And those very different bloodlines are going to complement one another's weaknesses. There are people who argue that one reason why the United States has been preeminent in many fields for so long is that we are a nation of immigrants. My best friend, my niece, the closest thing I'll ever have to a daughter, has bloodlines that come from England and Germany and Europe on her father's side, and Han Chinese nobility on her mother's side. And two very different lines there. One line of Christian Chinese, one line of aristocratic Chinese. The communists loved them. That's why they got out of there before Tiananmen Square. So my niece has bloodlines from opposite sides of the world that probably haven't mixed in at least 2,000 or 3,000 years, maybe longer. That produces a genetic strength. See, the Nazis were actually wrong. Racists are actually wrong. The notion of purebreds, if you know anything about dog breeding, purebreds tend to have problems because they're breeding too close to one another. American German Shepherd dogs, for example, have a problem with hip dysplasia. German Shepherds don't tend to have that problem if they're from West German lines. East German Shepherds, on the other hand, are emotionally unstable because the East Germans under Soviet leadership wanted to produce vicious dogs. The West Germans wanted to produce disciplined dogs. The Americans wanted to produce large dogs, and thus the hip dysplasia. If you breed too close so that both sides are fairly similar or congruent, you don't get the cross-pollination that makes sexual reproduction benefit over time by combining the strengths of bloodlines. See, theoretically, you are the best of your mom and dad, and they are the best of their mom and dad. I know it doesn't work that way in reality because we're more complex creatures than that, and psychology has a lot to do with it, so does free will. But theoretically, what sexual reproduction allows us is the opportunity to get the best of both bloodlines. In either case, in any case, it's a different way of looking at the Hegelian dialectic. Thesis meets antithesis. They fall in love and get married, and they have syntheses as children. What you need to understand, though, is that nobody saw the dialectic in terms of breeding back then. Least of all, Karl Marx. He saw the dialectic in terms of conflict. And conflict is going to be the way people approach this, even to this day. Seeing no questions or comments, moving on. The Concert of Europe under Metternich lasts for 33 years. Arguably, it lasts for 99, from 1815 to 1914, in that Metternich's chief goal was to avoid a great war. And from the end of the Napoleonic Wars to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which sparks World War I, his Concert of Europe produces a peace in Europe which basically lasts. There are a couple of minor wars, there are a couple of medium-sized wars, but there is no great war between first-class powers, much as there hasn't been a great war between the great powers since 1945. Were China and us to engage in a great war, the world would change radically, whoever won, because both China and us are first-class powers. The Russians are dangerous, but they're not fully a first-class power. But since they're in the palms of China right now, they would ally with China, just as presumably Europe would align with us. Still, you never know. All bets would be off because thesis and antithesis would come together in a death struggle. But even on the small scale, Metternich's idea of the Concert of Europe to prevent revolution lasts from 1815 to 1848. The only exception to this is France. Of course, it's France. France does have a liberal revolution in the 1820s. But the French, at that point, make absolutely clear to everyone that what they are doing has limited goals, and they are not at all interested in exporting their revolution. Why? Because Nicholas I wants to march on Paris. Because the Prussians and the Austrians also are willing to march on Paris. And the British as well. If the French do anything that indicates a second great struggle like the original French Revolution unleashes. So there is some political change in France, but it largely remains isolated to France. And so I argue that Metternich's system basically still lasts through the revolutionary year of 1848. But 33 years is a long time. It's a generation and a half. It's enough time for a lot of people who remember the old Napoleonic Wars to die off or to become old and senile, especially with lifespans in those days. And so, well, why not make a better world? So, it's not called the Revolutionary Year of 1848 for nothing. While Metternich's system has lasted, while the political stability of Europe has been preserved, what radicals and Marxists later call reaction, the forces of monarchism, papism, and so forth, the rapid industrialization of society in a variety of places throughout Europe, and the continuing percolation of nationalistic ideas creates more and more strain upon Metternich's Concert of Europe. Nationalism. We're going to talk a lot more about nationalism, but I'll give you a summary right now. If we speak the same language, if we have the same customs, same manners, the same holidays, the same quaint little national dress, whether it be a Greek sort of toga or a German set of lederhosen, if we have the same basic philosophy and religion in our history, in our cultural DNA, then we are one people. And whether we're urban or rural, rich or poor, intelligent or stupid, educated or ignorant, whether we are progressive or conservative, we are one people. The characteristic of our cultural and ethnic unity trumps all differences. The most important thing is our national identity. Now, the United States is not properly a nation state. It was when it was first founded, in that it was primarily English colonials. But even then, it had black slaves in the South, and it had it had immigrant populations even then, and there were Native Americans. But as time has gone on, as this great melting pot has continued to be added to, we are not a nation state. What holds us together is not blood and soil nationalism. It's the Constitution and loyalty to notions of American freedom. That's why it is so dangerous when people call that into question, because there's nothing else holding us together. Just that belief in our common humanity, our common dignity as human beings, and our common destiny as free people. But in Europe, it's different. It still is different. To this day, the French do not accept the Arabs from their empire that came in after World War II. And every so often, there are terrible riots around Paris and other cities where whole neighborhoods burn, where cars are set on fire, where the police end up in riot gear getting defeated sometimes by Muslim crowds. Why? Because they're not French. Not in thought, not in word, not in deed. Why? Well, in part because they insist on remaining Algerian or Moroccan or whatever their point of origin is, because they insist on remaining Muslim rather than adopting into a modern secular society, but also because the French never accept them. They are not Francois. They are not of French stock. So they're outsiders. We have people whose families go back to the 1950s living in France, who've never been to the homeland, who still think of themselves as foreigners. We in the United States have less of that problem because we are an immigrant nation. But it isn't really until after World War II that European nationalism faced an influx of people from the outside. They're not used to it. Their culture is not built around assimilating immigrant groups. Ours is. So the idea of national unity was and is very powerful. The French Revolution unlocks it. The rest of Europe feels it. And in places like Hungary, in the Austrian Empire, the idea that we are ruled by a foreign power becomes more and more and more unbearable. Our nation is raped. Our nation is prostrate. Our nation is victimized. The Irish feel the same way under English rule. So you have tensions because of industrialism. You have tensions because of the desire for each nation of people to have its own state, each cultural and ethnic group to have its own country. But that is not the case. If you look at any map of Europe, you're going to see that the nation state is there in England and France. It's not there in Italy and Germany. It's not there in Poland. Poland's gone. The Russians conquered it. The Germans and Austrians conquered it. In 1848, all of these tensions pop out. And you have revolutions all across Germany, Italy, France, east into Poland. In England, they keep a lid on things. Because in England, the common idea of both their liberal and conservative party is to reform their way away from revolution. Like letting out steam in a steam engine, reducing the steam pressure from critical that's likely to explode the thing. You let off steam, and it never gets to that critical point of explosion. But the French, even with their radicalism, aren't radical enough for some. It's like the Antifa people who throw stones through the Democratic Party headquarters because Joe Biden doesn't, or Kamala Harris don't go far enough. There are revolutions and there are riots all over the place. Now, into this mix comes Karl Marx. And Marx is, well, I'll talk about Marx's background in a bit. Marx first makes himself known to the world by writing, in conjunction with a series of communist committees, what is called the Communist Manifesto, or the Manifesto of the Communist Party. It's a pamphlet. It's not a book. The Communist Manifesto is not the Bible of communism. That's Das Kapital, which I'll be explaining in detail tomorrow. But it starts out with a preamble, or an introduction, that should be heard. You get a sense of the man and the fierceness of the ideas, and so forth and so on. So the Communist Manifesto starts out: a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. One, communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. Two, it is high time that the communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. The fact that people call one another communists in opposition indicates that they are afraid of communism and they want to exercise it. Well, we're going to tell what communism is really about. So there is this sense of triumphalism and inevitability that Marx always affects in his writing, that we are the future and that the present is merely transient, and the world of the present will fight and resist us, malign and attack us, but in the end, they'll fail. Because we are the future. The future belongs to us. Marx never holds a job for a day in his life. He never works. He's a student, and he writes. And eventually he has to leave the continent of Europe. Germany is no longer safe for him. France is no longer safe for him, because Karl Marx, even though he comes from Saxony, same place Luther ends up radicalizing, Marx becomes persona non grata because he's considered to be a revolutionary and a traitor. He flees to London because in London, the British, because of their reform tendencies, allow free speech, as long as you're not trying to overthrow the British government actively. And what Marx is talking about is sort of universal. It's not aimed at the royal government in Britain. So he is allowed to live there. He spends his time in libraries, reading, absorbing information, and writing his synthesis of history, economics, culture, society, and revolution. He is the primary driving force. But how can he do this? He doesn't work. He doesn't earn money. The man who writes more about the workers than anyone up until that point in history never worked a day in his life. He has a partner. His partner is Friedrich Engels. Engels owns a factory. Engels makes his money as a capitalist, as a bourgeois factory owner who employs workers in a production line. Engels, through this work, provides Marx with all that he needs to live his life. Engels supports him. So the man who is going to excoriate capitalists, factory owners, the bourgeoisie, the townsmen, and their mentality, and their exploitation of the workers, is himself, supported by that very system that he decries. You can't make this stuff up. About a dozen years ago, one of my students was the daughter of a United States Navy Chief Petty Officer. She was half Caucasian and half Chamorro, which is the Guamanian people from Guam. And in the spring of her senior year, spring break, because we had February and April vacations in Maine. We only had 1 week off at Christmas. In spring break, she and her father went on a tour of Europe. It was a graduation present. Because she had gotten into the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, which is not easy to do. They went to Karl Marx's birthplace in Chemnitz, what under the communists was called Karl Marxstadt. And at Karl Marx's birthplace, it's a little museum, they have a gift shop. And in that gift shop, they sell, among other things, Karl Marx chocolates. For years, I had on my walls the wrapper to my Karl Marx candy bar, bought in the gift shop of Karl Marx's birthplace. And if you understand anything about communism, the thought of a gift shop at Karl Marx's birthplace is so funny. Because it goes against everything that Marx says that he stands for. I don't know if I still have it. I think it got lost on the move from Maine to here back in 2014. But you can look it up. I'm sure it's still there. I'm sure they still do a roaring business. I think we're going to leave it there. Do you have any questions, comments, or thoughts? Irony can be pretty ironic sometimes. Funny. Okay, you can talk among yourselves quietly. Thank you. Have a good day. You at home as well.